Hi everybody, it's Professor Olney. The topic for today is gross domestic product, GDP. These videos are going to replace what I would normally have done in lecture. So there's about 30 minutes, I hope, of video here to go through the definitions of GDP. You'll need to watch this instead of listening to me do it in class, because I'm not going to take as much time to talk about the basic definitions of GDP in class. Yet you need to understand all of this and you will be tested on it. So it's important for you to listen to the video, take some notes, bring up questions. If you have questions, post them on Piazza, ask them of your GSIs or me. So here we go. All right, gross domestic product, or GDP. GDP is the concept that we use to measure the total amount of output that's being produced. Remember, we're interested in this because John Maynard Keynes, who helped us to understand the determinants of unemployment, said that employment depends upon the total amount of output that's being produced. Well, that's great, but when he said this in the 1930s, we had no way of measuring the total amount of output being produced. It was a concept, but it was not something that we were able to measure. And so the economists who worked at the time in the 1930s to come up with this definition of gross domestic product realized that they wanted a definition that was tightly linked to John Maynard Keynes' theory of unemployment. What that means, and why I'm emphasizing this point, is that every time they had to make a decision about whether something was included in GDP or not included in GDP, the principle they fell back on was the principle of whether or not this thing, this activity that they were trying to decide whether or not to include it in GDP, whether or not this activity generated employment. If it generated employment, it would be included. If it didn't generate employment, it would not be included. So always remember that's the principle that lies behind this concept of gross domestic product. All right. So let's see. Ooh, wrong button. Here I go. There we go. All right. So Keynes. Employment depends upon the amount of output produced. Great, groovy theory. How are we going to measure the amount of output that's being produced? We're going to measure the amount of output that's being produced using this concept of gross domestic product, or GDP. GDP, a good definition, is that GDP is the total annual economic output in a nation. And what I want to do is walk you through each of those words in that phrase to make sure that we're clear on what it means. All right, first one, total. So when we talk about GDP as the total annual economic output in a nation, what we mean is that we're adding up, we're coming up with one number that at one time gives us the total amount of apples and books and missiles and teacher salaries and haircuts and everything else that's being produced. So we're going to sum or aggregate or add together each of these many things that's produced in an economy. It's the total annual value, because the gross domestic product is always expressed as an annual number. That is to say, it's always how much output could be produced in a nation in 1 year. Now, even though it's given to us as an annual figure, GDP is reported every 3 months. So it's reported quarterly. So for instance, whoops, I need a pen. The 2019 quarter 2, so that's how we write this. We write it as the year, and then a colon, and then there's going to be two numbers, 1, 2, 3, or 4 in Roman numerals that reflect the quarter. So the 2019 second quarter GDP is telling us if the economy were to produce for 12 months at the pace it produced for those 3 months, that is the second quarter, April, May, and June, it will produce the amount of output that is GDP. So on the next slide, maybe 2 later, I've got that the nominal GDP in 2019 second quarter in the United States was equal to $21.3 trillion. That doesn't mean that $21.3 trillion worth of economic output was produced in the United States in those 3 months. It means that if production continued for 12 months at the pace it was going for those 3 months of April, May, and June, the second quarter, then we would have over 12 months 21.3. So roughly you can divide it by 4. So 5.5 or so trillion dollars worth of stuff was produced in the economy in that second quarter of 2019. There. The third phrase is economic output. So economic output, when we talk about economic output, output is goods and services. So by output we mean goods and services. I'm going to use G and S as my shorthand for goods and services. Goods and services, it's a great phrase. It's just a pain to write it over and over and over. And so I will use G and S as my shorthand of goods and services. Goods and services are output, so that's stuff, the things that we produce. Goods are tangible things, things that exist physically that you can touch. Services are output, they're products, things like me teaching right now or talking to a lawyer or something like that. But they're not tangible, you can't touch them. You can't touch them. Economic output, that's where this relationship to employment comes in. So when we talk about economic output, it's important that you know that not all output, not all goods or services that are produced in an economy are included in GDP. Only the things that are exchanged in a market, the things that are related to employment, and that's what we mean by economic output. So the things that are related to employment, those are included in GDP because that was what they were going for, was a measure of total output that was really linked to employment. The fourth phrase is in a nation. The distinction here is between what's produced in a nation, so what's within the borders, the boundaries, the geographic edges of a nation. So what's produced within the geography of a nation is included in that nation's GDP. It does not matter who owns the factories. So a multinational I don't care who owns the multinational. What I care is where is it located. So a multinationally owned factory that's located in the state of Kentucky is in the United States GDP. A multinationally owned factory that's in Thailand is in Thailand's GDP. So what matters is where it's located, because once again, we're looking for a measure of output that's really tightly linked to employment. And then next we want to think about the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. So the difference between nominal and real GDP is what prices are we going to use. Now remember we said that the amount of GDP, there we go, is the total annual economic output in a nation. Well, the way that we compute the total is by taking the prices of each good times the quantities of those goods and then adding them up. So for instance, if I was to compute the nominal GDP for 2004, I would take, so I'm going to say nominal GDP for 2004, I would take the prices of apples in 2004 times the quantity of apples that were produced in 2004 and add to that the price of books in 2004 times the quantity of books in 2004 and so on and so forth for all of the various goods and services that are produced. So when we say nominal GDP uses current prices, it means we're using the prices of the same year we're talking about. If I was computing the nominal GDP for 2005, I would use the price of apples in 2005 times the quantity of apples that were produced in 2005 plus the price of books in 2005 times the quantity of books in 2005, and so on and so forth. The challenge with nominal GDP is that GDP could increase between these 2 years, between 2004 and 2005. I did not really want that thick of a line. It could increase between 2004 and 2005, either because the quantities increased or because the prices increased. Either one, right? Well, what real GDP does is real GDP says, look, we're going to use the same prices for every year. There is a technical way of doing this. It's called chain weighting. For my purposes, it's not important that you understand chain weighting. If you want to work for the Bureau of Economic Analysis, you should understand what chain weighting is, but for our purposes, I'm not worried about it. So for our purposes, you can think of real GDP this way, that real GDP is using the prices from some base year. So they choose a year, currently it's 2012. They choose a year, and then regardless of what year's GDP they're calculating, they're going to use the prices from that particular base year. So for instance, it goes like this. If we're computing I'm red now. If we're computing real GDP for 2004, we're going to use the prices of apples in the base year. I'll use BY for base year, times the quantity of apples that were produced in 2004, plus the price of books in the base year times the quantity of books that were produced in 2004, and so on and so forth, for all the goods and services that are produced in the economy. And then if I want to compute real GDP for the next year, 2005, I'm going to use the prices of apples again in the same base year. So I'm not changing the prices. I'm using the exact same prices I used in the previous calculation. But now it's times the quantity of apples produced in 2005 plus the price of books in the base year times the quantity of books produced in 2005, and so on and so forth for all of the goods and services produced in that particular year. What that means is that the change between the real GDP of 2004 and 2005, since the prices are the same, there's no change in the prices, any change in real GDP has to be due to changes in the quantities. And remember, it's the quantity of output that's going to be linked to the amount of employment. So jobs depend upon how much people are producing, not how much the thing they're producing sells for. And so real GDP is going to be our tighter link to the total amount of output that's being, real GDP is going to be our tighter link to employment. How big is real GDP? 2019 quarter two, as I mentioned, GDP was $21.3 trillion. 21.3 trillion is 21 million, 21 with a whole lot of zeros after it. If you divide that by the population, you're going to get the per capita GDP, and that's around $65,000 for 2019's second quarter. This data, as with most of the data that we'll use, comes from FRED. FRED is a resource that you need to be able to use. There'll be some problems on the problem set that ask you to use FRED. It's going to be your source of most data for the macro half of the course. Okay. Now, not everything that generates output is counted in GDP. There are some omissions from GDP that we're well aware of, and so let's talk about those right now. For instance, non-market activities. Remember that link to employment. If there's no employment generated from an activity, then it's not going to be included in GDP. I made my bed this morning. That was good. That was great. That's not my job. My job is not to make the bed. It was not part of my employment. If I had stayed in a hotel and the maid had come in and made the bed, typically she would be employed as somebody who makes the bed. In that case, making the bed is a market activity. Somebody is employed. She's getting paid for doing that. If you made your own breakfast this morning, that's great. Good for you. A good breakfast is a way to start the day, but that's not your job. If you went to Pete's, never Starbucks, always Pete's. If you went to Pete's and bought your breakfast, now it's a market activity. Now it's counted in GDP because now it's generating employment. So something has to be generating employment to be counted in GDP. Activities that we do, things we do for ourselves, cleaning our homes, making our food, taking care of our kids, that kind of stuff, volunteer work, there's no employment in that, and so it's not counted in GDP. The second thing that's not counted in GDP is unreported cash income, and the key here is the unreported part. The data for GDP come from a whole variety of resources that the government uses to estimate the amount of GDP. One of the big resources they use are our tax returns. The Form 1040, I think, that we file in the winter of each year on which we report our income and then we report how much taxes we've paid and how much we still owe or what our refund is going to be. Those tax returns that we all turn in, plus the information that comes from our employers, that's one of the big sources they have for estimating GDP. Well, if you're paid in cash and that cash is not reported, so the person who paid you doesn't report it to the government, you don't report it on your taxes, there's no way for the government to know how much income you had because it's unreported. So the key here is not that it's cash, the key is that it's unreported. So unreported cash income is not included, and that's not because it shouldn't be, but because there are no data. And illegal activities, similarly, illegal activities are also not included in GDP, again, it's a data issue. Most people who are doing illegal activities don't report those illegal activities on their tax returns, and therefore there's no record of them, and therefore they're not included in GDP. You know, an interesting little side effect of that is that when cannabis became legal in California, that means an activity that for many years had been happening in California but had been illegal suddenly became legal and becomes reported in California's GDP. Even though there hadn't really been any change in the total amount of output that was being produced, it just went from being an illegal activity that was not reported on anybody's tax return to a legal activity that is regulated and taxed, and so now it shows up in GDP. You can get little quirks like that. All right. There we go. There's two different ways that we have of measuring GDP. There's no direct measure of total value of output. So this pen that I'm writing with, this is the output. The pen is the output. What's the value of this thing? Well, we don't have an answer to that unless we know one of two things. Either we know the income that was earned from producing and selling this pen, or we know how much the university paid for this pen, and either of those two numbers are going to give us the value of this output. So when we measure GDP, we can measure it either by adding up the total amount of income that is earned by the people who produce, distribute, sell a product, or we can measure GDP by adding up the total value of expenditure, how much the university, for instance, paid for this pen. And those are our ways of measuring the total value of output. So the total value of output, that is to say GDP, the total value of output, which is GDP, can either be computed by doing the total value of income, how much income was how much income was earned for producing the pen and selling it, or how much the university paid for it. Those two numbers, the total value of income, the total value of expenditure, both should be the same thing. So if they paid $200 for this pen, then all of the people, including the company owners who were involved in producing and selling this pen, earned that $200. And so the income they earned, the $200, is the $200 the university spent, and that gives us our dollar value of output. Let's focus on that total expenditure, the total expenditure for goods and services. The total expenditure for goods and services has four major components to it, and it represents spending by four major groups of people. The first major component to total expenditure is consumption spending, and we're going to shorthand consumption spending with the letter C. Consumption spending in the United States is about 70% of the total spending in the economy. This is spending by households for final goods and services. So consumption spending, which is the spending by households for final goods and services, C. The second component of expenditure for goods and services, that is our measure of real GDP, is investment spending, and we're going to use an uppercase I to stand for investment spending. In the United States, investment spending is about 15% of the total, and this is spending by businesses for construction of new buildings or reconstruction of existing buildings. So a remodel of the kitchen counts, and a building of a new house or an office building or a classroom building counts. Purchases of equipment by purchases of equipment by businesses, and equipment is also called producer durables. We can think of equipment as things that last several years, so you use it over and over again. And also changes in the value of their inventory holdings. So the value of goods that, say, Target has on its shelf, they measure that measure it once a quarter, but they really measure it very carefully once a year. And if the total dollar value of things that they have on their shelf goes up between September 30th, 2018 and September 30th, 2019, that's an increase in their inventory holdings. It's recorded as part of investment spending. If the total amount of goods and services that Target has on their shelves goes down between September 30th, 2018 and September 30th, 2019, that's a decrease in their inventory holdings, and so there would be a negative entry in investment spending in that particular case. Now, with investment spending, oftentimes there's a lot of confusion between what's an investment good and what's an intermediate good. So let me just lay it out here. for you. Investment, remember I just said, investment is business spending for equipment, for construction of structures, for changes in inventory holdings. And so we call those things capital. So business investment is business spending for capital. And investment goods are used but not used up in the process of producing other goods and services. So for instance, if you are running a factory and making garments in your factory, you're going to have sewing machines in that factory. You're going to use those sewing machines, but as you use those sewing machines, you're not using them up. You use that same sewing machine over and over and over and over and over to make thousands of different garments. So that's a piece of capital, that's a piece of equipment, and the purchase of that sewing machine would be part of a business's investment spending. On the other hand, we have intermediate goods. Intermediate goods are often services. We call them goods, but they're services too. Intermediate goods, that's the business's spending for goods and services that are used as inputs in the production process. So this is not capital. These are things that are used up. So for instance, when they made this top that I'm wearing, there was some fabric. They used up the fabric to make this particular top. They can't use this fabric to make any other top. It's in my top. It can't be in another top. And so the fabric was an intermediate good because it was used up when producing this particular top. The sewing machine, that was capital. They're going to use it to make this top. They're going to make another top. They're going to make lots of tops with the same sewing machine. But this particular fabric, this particular thread, is there a button? This particular button, there's a button, in this particular top, used up. These were inputs in the production of this particular top. Now, one of the things I want to point out is that you don't see stocks and bonds here anyplace. Investment spending has nothing to do with the stock market or the bond market. If someone has taught you that investment means buying stocks, that would be wrong in an economics class. For an economist, for anybody who's talking about the macroeconomy, anybody who's talking about the economy as a whole, anybody who's talking about whether there's a recession coming, when they're talking about investment by a business, they're talking about businesses spending for equipment and for construction of structures. Really, 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 really important to remember that. All right, so we had consumption and investment. The third component, erase all my markers. The third component of expenditure is government spending. We're going to use an uppercase G to stand for government spending. This is purchases of goods and services by state, local, and federal government agencies. So my salary is included in here because I work for the University of California. If I worked for Stanford, my salary would not be included because that's not a state school. In the United States, government spending is about 20% of the total expenditure. And then finally, we have export spending. Export spending, we're going to use EX to stand for export spending. For the United States, exports are an increasing but still relatively small share of the total, and I'll show you some graphs in class. About 10 to 12% of total expenditure these days is export spending, and that's purchases by the rest of the world of goods and services produced here in the United States. So export spending is the rest of the world's spending for goods and services produced in this economy. On the other hand, there's import spending. Imports, we're going to use IM to stand for imports. Imports are about 15 to 17% for the United States right now. That's spending by U.S. households, people who are doing consumption spending, U.S. businesses, the people who are doing investment spending, and U.S. government agencies, federal, state, and local government agencies, for goods and services that were produced outside of the United States. So not produced here in the U.S., but produced outside of the United States. So import spending is spending for by domestic folks, you and me, but for goods and services produced in other countries. All right. Our total expenditure then, aggregate expenditure, is the consumption plus the investment plus the government plus the exports minus the imports. That equation, the aggregate demand or aggregate expenditure, is C plus I plus G plus exports minus imports. You have to know that as well as you know your SID. You got to know that equation. I don't care. There's no way around it. You got to know it. C plus I plus G plus exports minus imports. You're going to work with it in section in thinking about what are the different activities that go in each of those categories. So I'm going to have you do some allocations in class. I'll give you a blue and gold that has you do some allocations, and there'll also be one in section as well. But you've got to know that equation, C plus I plus G plus exports minus imports. A lot of people ask, why do we subtract imports? Remember what we're going for. This is total expenditure for GDP, for goods and services that generate employment in our economy. And so what we want is we want the expenditure for goods and services that are produced in this economy. Well, the way that the data are gathered, we're not going to get the data nice and clean that way. The data for consumption includes both the purchases of domestically produced goods and services and the purchases of foreign produced consumer goods and services. But those foreign produced consumer goods and services, those aren't generating jobs here in the United States. Those are generating jobs in whatever country they're being produced in. We're not really interested in those. We've got to get rid of those for our total of aggregate demand or aggregate expenditure for gross domestic product. Investment spending. Investment spending is businesses' purchases of domestically produced machines and buildings that we're interested in, but also investment spending includes U.S. businesses' purchases of foreign produced machines and buildings. So it includes if that sewing machine I was talking about was manufactured in Italy, that is going to be an investment spending. But for employment in the United States, making a sewing machine, that generated employment in Italy when they manufactured the machine. So there was a manufacturing job in Italy manufacturing that sewing machine. We don't want to have that somehow in our measure of total expenditure for goods and services produced in the U.S. economy. Government spending includes the government's purchases of domestically produced goods and services plus the government's purchases of foreign produced goods and services. Here's a great example, the Bay Bridge. The Bay Bridge the new part of the Bay Bridge that goes from the East Bay over to the island on your way to San Francisco. Big chunks of that were produced in China and then shipped over here on humongous barges. And then it was fascinating, you should be here to watch it, but you can't because it happened years ago. And then they would take those stretches of the Bay Bridge platform, the roadway that we drive on, and they would lift them up into place. Well, that was a government agency's purchase of a foreign produced roadbed. That generated a lot of employment, the production of that roadbed, but not here in the United States. And so what we want to do is we're going to take we're going to take the consumption plus the investment plus the government plus the exports, because those are all about purchases of domestically produced goods and services. And then we're going to subtract off these purchases of foreign produced goods and services. Well, it just so happens that all of this wonderful stuff here in gold, don't you like the blue and gold? All this stuff here in gold, I'll have to use orange, the purchases of foreign produced consumer goods plus the purchases of foreign produced machines and buildings plus the purchases of foreign produced goods and services by government, you know what that equals? That equals imports. And so if I take the total consumption and the total investment and total government and total exports and subtract off the pieces that are imports, what am I left with? I'm left with the blue boxes. I know this is a mess, but I'm left with the blue boxes, the purchases of domestically produced goods and services. That's what we want because that's what's going to be really linked to employment here in the United States. So there you go. That gave you some of the background about GDP. What we're going to do in class is this gives me more time to actually look at the data and talk about what's happened with gross domestic product, with the various components of GDP over the last years to see how it impacted the Great Recession, 2007, 2009, what seems to be happening with those components of GDP today. We'll get to do a lot more playing with the data in class because now you've got some of the basics down. So I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you in class. Go Bears!